Hi everyone, this is Raven from Curious Corporate Publishing, and we are here tonight to do an interview with Grace R. Reynolds, the author of Lady of the House, which debuts on the 15th. So soon, so exciting. Grace is going to be on in just a little bit so that we can start talking about her book, but I always like to come on a little bit earlier. Hello everybody, welcome. I always like to come on a little bit earlier and just kind of talk up my author a little bit and tell you a little bit about everything that's been going on. So I am very excited to be part of Lady of the House. It's been such an exciting journey from like the very beginning when Grace first came up with the concept of it. I thought it was incredibly intriguing and exciting. And as she began building it and putting it together, it was just, hello, welcome. We're just talking about Grace Reynolds and her upcoming book, Lady of the House, which debuts on the 15th. So exciting. We have signed copies already that are going to be shipping out really soon. And very, very soon we'll have more available in the Curious Corporate shop as well. So, welcome. Grace is going to be hopping on in a few minutes. And we're going to answer all your questions about her book. And then at the end, Grace will draw a winner for the book giveaway that we ran. So if you hop over to our Instagram page, you can see that we started a book giveaway last week. If you dropped a question for Grace to answer during our live stream, you were automatically entered into a pool in order to win a copy of her book. So we will be pulling that at the end of the live stream. So I'm very lucky that all of the authors that I've had the pleasure of working with so far are all really wonderful and talented people. And it's just been an incredibly exciting and humbling experience so far. So I hope that you all will, after you see this live and you kind of interact with Grace a little bit and you see what a intriguing and exciting book this is, I hope you all will consider checking it out for her. It will be available in a worldwide distribution, so you can buy it on Amazon, on Kindle, in your bookstores, and then we'll have signed copies through Curious Corporate restocked again really soon. So, hi Jennifer, it's good to see you. I hope all is well out in your neck of the woods. We're starting to just get snow out here. So, but I guess maybe that means we'll have snow for Christmas. So, yes. I'm so excited for this interview. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I wish that I had a physical copy to show you and like hold up and like wave around, but the post office is lagging a little bit. So unfortunately I don't have any copies to show you, but if you've been on our Instagram at all lately, then you've seen the covers of her book, which is, I think, incredibly it stands out in terms of like horror and dark poetry because it's a bright yellow. And here's Grace, yay, the lady of the hour, to talk about the Lady of the House. And here we go. Hello.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Are you excited to talk about your book this evening?
I am. Let's do this. I'm ready to talk about it. I'm excited to discuss. The questions are really good, so I'm really excited to get into them.
You did. You got a lot of really good questions. I'm really excited to see what your answers are going to be for all of them.
I feel like it gives me more credit than I'm worth.
So we'll just jump right into it then now that we have you here.
Okay.
And we're going to start off with our Instagram live questions. So these were questions that were dropped on the post announcing your interview, and if people dropped a question for you to be answered live, they got to be entered into win a copy of your book. So those are the ones that we're going to go through first.
Oh, right.
So our first question, there it is. I was just talking about how I was so upset I didn't have a copy to show myself.
Oh, girl.
Look at it. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, the quality came out really nice. I'm sorry to interrupt. I was like, I just had to show you. It's so beautiful in person.
It is beautiful. You do like the whole spin like a model. Gorgeous.
It's really beautiful. I'm so like proud with how this turned out, Raven. Like this is just stunning. I love it.
That's what I like to hear. All right. So question number one. How many times do you revise a poem before you decide it's done?
I think you already know the answer to this, and it's a lot. A lot. I am when I'm writing poetry, I think I second guess myself a lot. And so I initially I'll write something that instinctually comes to me, and then when I'm done, I read through it over and over and over again. And I look at little tiny words. I'm like, okay, well that if I say it out loud, like that doesn't sound like it flows well. I need to change that. So I would say I say many times to that question in particular. Like I can't say anything less than 5. And even then I feel like it's a lot more than that.
I think that's fair. I mean, it is a lot of work to make sure that it's like the way that it's supposed to come out, like the way that you want it to be,
Yeah,
in
well,
the end.
especially with poetry too, like, you want to be able to read it out loud, and you want to, especially when you're reading someone else's poetry, like sometimes I found myself in a book where I will read something out loud to just to understand what the rhythm of the author was. Um, but yeah, it's especially with flow. I think back about like how I get picky about words. If you're familiar with Robert Kazi at all, he's told me some really great advice before. He's like, whatever the first word in your head is, like that's the one. Like don't second guess it. So like I've caught myself doing that. Like, okay, nope, it's the word that came first. That's the one I'm gonna to commit to.
That's good advice too, because like
Mhm.
when you're writing a piece of poetry, the whole point is to express some kind of emotion, right? So
Right.
yeah, whatever it is that pops in your head at the beginning is probably something that should stay there.
Yeah.
All right. So building on that, our second question is how hard or easy was it to keep a narrative flowing between the metaphors and poetry?
So I liked this question a lot. I think Michael asked this question, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't necessarily find it too difficult, only because I am a planner. I like to write outlines. I like to. I had a very clear vision with this book. Like there were specific milestones that the lady was supposed to make in this book, and I had to figure out, okay, like these poems have to make sure that they hit these beats like throughout. So sometimes it was, I wouldn't say it was difficult so much as I had to be really objective with a lot of what I was writing because I think that it can be really fun to fall into like purple prose, for example, but purple prose are not always accessible to readers, and like all this beautiful language can completely conceal the message behind the poem. Um,
Yeah,
like yeah. So
I agree.
I found myself having to be very mindful of that. So yeah, but yeah, that's I didn't think it was terribly too difficult so much as just being mindful of, if I'm going to put this out there, who is the audience that I want to be able to understand what I'm writing. If you put too many pretty words in there, then the message is lost.
So I really like that answer too. That's something I think a lot. I think about that a lot when I write poetry
Mhm.
as well. Is it can be very tantalizing to like throw in like a bunch of special words and metaphors
Mhm.
and stuff like that. It's a really thoughtful balance when
Mhm.
you're creating something that is supposed to convey a specific tone or theme or emotion.
Mhm.
So your book, it's kind of dark, it's kind of murdery, it's deliciously delightful.
Deliciously
So,
delightful.
what deliciously delightful? So, how about your top 5 horror films or books of all time?
I loved this question, and I was afraid of this question because I'm really fortunate to have a lot of friends in this online community that are so just knowledgeable in the realm of horror. Like they know all the films, they know so many great authors and their collective works, and truthfully, I'm really new to horror in literature. Horror in film is something I'm more familiar with. So I started with that first when I was making my list. I'm like, oh my gosh, like what are my favorite like 5 horror films? And so when I was younger, I would come home from school, like in high school. This is what, like, the really, really early days of Netflix. It was like 2009, 2010, I forget. But I would come home from school, and before my parents would come home from work, I would turn on and find the horror movies on, like, on demand or whatever it would be. And so a lot of what I found kind of comes from this list too. But so I, in no particular order, some of these are newer, some of these are older. I listed as my 5 favorite horror movies: Get Out, The Silence of the Lambs, The Conjuring, The Mist, Midsummer, and then this other one people might not be as familiar with. It's a Japanese horror film. It is called The Suicide Club. And I wouldn't call it a favorite so much as it's the one that's haunted me the most since I've seen it. The premise of it is that it's a pop band in Japan, and they have the subliminal messages in their music that's causing teens to to commit acts of mass suicide. So it's terrifying to think about. And it is. It was like back in 2008 or 2007, I think this movie came out. And so that's one that has always stuck with me. I don't always remember the names, but I really love Japanese horror films too.
That's interesting. I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah, it's really I like a lot of their settings. I've noticed have been like in hospitals or schools, and it's cool to see how it differs from like American horror in film. Like a lot of ours are like Cabin in the Woods, or it's a paranormal story in
that's
old
true.
house. But when I thought about books that I had read, since I'm so new to literature and horror, I had to really go off of what I read this year, because the last thing I really read, truthfully, was Carrie, and that was back in high school. So it's been a very long time. And this is the most I've ever read this entire year. Like last year, I think I read 4 books. I read 37 this year. Big change. And I think the
That's
bookstagram's
a big change
for that. It is a big change. Well, I think it also is a reminder that reading is a practice too.
Yeah,
like,
that's true.
Like the more you read, the more you get used to reading more. And but yeah, so this year I'm actually going to go off of what I've read for my top 5, since I got exposed to so many wonderful things. Most of these are indie, because I think that I hang out with the indie community.
Absolutely. Indie is where it's at.
It really is. Well, I like indie too, because it feels like there's just more creative freedom in indie writing. And so I like that. I don't know, maybe it's a little less predictable than mainstream publishing, right?
I like to think that it is. I like to think that, like, the indie realm, it's because it's its own thing. The indie realm is so budding and bursting with potential that is just not mainstream, which I think is the most delightful thing about it. Because I feel like, and don't get me wrong, there are a lot of really wonderful mainstream books, but I feel so many of them follow the same kinds of narratives, or they have the same kinds of like cliche kinds of things in them.
Yeah, you get kind of tired of reading the same thing over and over again, the same story. And I think that's what I really like about indie. I think that there's more opportunities to connect with authors in the indie sphere. I think for the most part, it's a really supportive community. I've been really thankful to be part of a group that intentionally reads diverse literature, which has been so awesome, because it opens your eyes to perspectives that you otherwise would not have. And there are stories that need to be told. And I've just been so fortunate. But this list, so in no particular order, some of the people that are watching will be familiar with this. It's a combination of novels, novellas, and poetry. The first is The Fear by Spencer Hamilton. And for those that don't know, it is a pandemic horror story, but it's really more about the relationship. On theme. It's about the relationship between the 2 characters. And I read that earlier this year, and oh my gosh, I loved it. I think I read it in 2 days. It was great. And Spencer, they write wonderfully. The second would be like Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke by Eric LaRocca, which is it's a polarizing book for a lot of people, but I think people in the horror community more than not appreciate this book. But it's about a sadomasochist relationship between 2 women in an online chat room in the early 2000s. And there's so many layers to this book. And that I can appreciate it for what it is. And it's terrifying because it's just terrifying. I tell myself, like, maybe my limit is LaRocca's writing, like what I can take as a reader. And this third one, which I've given a lot of praise for, is Into the Woods and All the Way Through by Cynthia Pelayo. That is a really, really heartbreaking collection of true crime poetry that it scared the living daylights out of me. So her central message is that somebody knows something. And I'll tell you, Raven, when I was reading it, I got to my home state of New Jersey, the poetry that was for those states and the missing cases, and one was my hometown. And oh my God, I became so emotional reading it. I had to stop and I had to like actually message my mother, like, do you know this person? Do you remember this person's name? And she's like, oh yeah, like your aunt knew this person. And it's just terrifying to think about, like, how she could bring that so close to home. And so that collection is definitely my top 5 this year for sure. Hi, Spencer. I just gave you praise for your book because I loved it. Fourth one, I was really fortunate to read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley this year. And I thought, for how much I love like Edgar Allan Poe and whatnot, I had never read Frankenstein. And I definitely would say that's my top 5 this year. And I was really fortunate to have been able to provide a lot of commentary to our fellow Corvid, David Grinnell, because as you know, he's a literary scholar in Gothic literature.
Yeah, it's perfect.
I loved being able to, I'm like, oh my gosh, David, I can't believe this happened. So I really loved that. I loved the despair. I think it reminds me why I like the Gothic so much, especially like the older Gothic. And then the final one, I just can't stop gushing over, is a collection of nightmares by Christina Sung, it's a haunting collection of poetry that feels very dystopian in nature, and it's very emotional. And I love her poetry, and I can't wait to read her other collection, collection of Dreamscapes, I believe it's called. But yeah, for the most part, all indie writers.
All indie.
They were phenomenal. Yeah, so those are my top 5s. Sorry, I got so excited about it.
Oh no, you're fine. Oh my God, yeah. Don't get excited about books here on an interview while we're talking about books. Like, come on now, be realistic. I have Into the Woods and All the Way Through. I haven't started reading it yet, but I am excited and also really nervous to read it, considering all of the comments that I've heard about it.
It's a heavy collection, but you know what's real great about that? It reminds readers that reality is horror.
It is. It really is.
I think a lot of people have this misconception of what horror is, and like what people who don't read the genre, what they think it is, they need to throw those expectations out the window.
I think that's a fair point. Life is horror. All right, so one of the things that I think is so unique about your collection is the addition of recipes. I mean, we're talking about a housewife, right? So it just makes sense. But I just really felt like that makes it just stand out and also makes it more tangible in a way. So speaking on your recipes, what is your favorite recipe and what would be Lady's favorite recipe?
I loved this question, and it gives me a little bit of opportunity to talk about the creation of this collection. I think you were the first person I told, like, I'm gonna write a poetry collection about this, I think. But for me personally, I have 2. So my favorite go-to recipe is called a chicken braid. And it sounds really bland on the surface, but it's a Pampered Chef recipe.
Are we braiding chicken?
We're braiding chicken. No, we're not braiding chicken. It's basically, you take Pillsbury crescent rolls and you take two cylinders, and you place them on a pan in the like 8 triangles pretty much, and then you cook some chicken and you put it in a food processor with broccoli and red pepper and a couple other things, and you mix it up with cheese and mayo and some dill, dill was the herb, and then you put the mixture in the Pillsbury dough crescent rolls, and then you braid the crescent rolls over the mixture and you put it in the oven. It takes 25 minutes to make. It's my go-to recipe. Although my husband
sounds really good.
My husband calls my mother though every time that I make it to tease me because I make it so often. But you know, like when you have a go-to recipe, like
Oh
you know,
yeah. Oh yeah.
um, but then the second one I was gonna say for myself, I'm a very nostalgic person. Um, and so for me, my favorite recipe is probably stuffed cabbage. It's also called sarma, and I make it with my grandmother because it's her mom's recipe. And
Oh,
so
that's nice.
yeah, so when I see her, if it's not stuffed cabbage or sarma, is what my grandma's culture calls it. It's stuffed peppers, which is pinion paprika, and so like a lot of people are more familiar with stuffed peppers as a recipe too, but those are my personal favorites. And so the lady of the house, there are quite a couple recipes. I'm just going to pull one out here to see if I can find it. So like you can see just the book, like yeah, it looks like a little recipe book, like a cookbook. But I actually chose ambrosia. And I think that the folks who have arced the book, they'll probably know why I picked that one in particular. But something that people will find when they're reading The Lady of the House is that the character lady is very preoccupied with presentation and coming across as, you know, like her role, the lady of the house. And so I don't want to give away spoilers, but it would be ambrosia.
I can see that.
Hmm. Yeah. So.
So we are talking about Lady. She's got a lot going on in her life, right? And the whole
Yeah.
book is about her. But we never actually see her have a name in the story. Does
Hmm.
Lady have a name?
No. Like I was very intentional. Um, None of the characters have names. There's only three of them, and the reason why I did that was because I I didn't want to necessarily like say what she looked like. I didn't want to give her a name because I wanted people to be able to step into her shoes that much easier. Like I wanted them to be able to just see the title for what it was. And I don't know. I think there's something to be said. I to remove those descriptions, to you know the label of a name can let people access that world just a little bit more and be immersed in that
Yeah,
whole experience.
absolutely. Yeah, I know when I read through it the first time, I felt like there was so many of her qualities that I could identify with.
Mm-hmm.
And then I could just kind of like build this own vision in my head as to what I thought her circumstances and her life and even she was like. And I think that is that's really nice feature when it comes to creating a character because most characters are very personalized according to the author. So to
Mm-hmm.
create kind of this faceless character that still has so many defining qualities, I feel is a
Mm-hmm.
really incredible achievement to be able to create. So while you were building this collection and diving into these parts of Lady and building your poems, were there many poems that didn't make the last edit? And if so, did you find it hard not to include them?
So not as many poems as people would think. Um, I before I sent the whole manuscript over to my editor, Kendra Austin. A lot of my friends in the poetry community will know who Kendra is, and she's great. Um,
She
before
is
I
great.
sent before I sent over the manuscript, I probably went through it a couple of times myself because I wanted to give her as complete of a project as I could, and I probably took out about 5 poems only because I didn't think that they served the narrative. I thought that they were really lovely poems, but I think you've read the book. Every single poem is intentional.
Yeah, it is.
If it doesn't serve the narrative, it got cut pretty much. But one thing that I cut some poems, right? But I actually wrote like more poems like after a certain point because there were things I was worried about. Like I wanted to make sure that it was clear the resentment that was building up in Lady, like that her feelings were valid. Like I wanted to be able to make sure that there were enough pieces to show her resentment growing and why it was growing. But yeah, so I don't know if I necessarily found it hard. I think probably writing the newer poems that I wrote to replace the poems that I cut were difficult to make sure that I was keeping with the narrative of the book.
Mm-hmm. I can see that because then I think when you first start building a collection, you kind of have like a vague idea of what it is you want to say and where you want to go, and you have
Mm-hmm.
like the studs of the piece, basically, that help build the whole framework of it. And sometimes it can be a little difficult to fill in all the pieces and, make it
Hmm.
all come together. But I mean, you did it really well. And I appreciate that every piece is intentional. I appreciate that there is no like filler episodes, so to speak. Um,
Yeah, because I didn't want there to feel like there was fluff either necessarily. I think
right.
that can be very alluring to add more poems to create the fluff, but
Mhm.
I find fluff to be distracting.
So when you were creating and building and building your extra fluff that isn't extra fluff, how did you go about conducting research for the book? Did you read a lot about the 1940s and post-war womanhood?
I really like this question, Shannon. um, so it really made me think about that. So I will give the skinny on this one. I read quite a bit about post-war womanhood, but my research only extended as far as it needed to fact check certain details of this book. Like, did a garbage disposal exist in the 1940s, 1950s? Like, those are the kind of things that I really did dive deep into researching to make sure that I didn't erroneously add some kind of detail in the lady's life that didn't fit in her world. So while I did do quite a bit of research, it serves more as a wallpaper behind the lady, and it's just background to create the setting, because ultimately the lady of the house's story about being a newly stay-at-home spouse after working in heavy machinery during World War II, being thrust into this role that she was not familiar with, feeling that purposelessness, and then also being trapped by whatever structures around her. In this case, in the 1940s and 50s, it was not as easy for women to make that decision to go live on their own. I wanted to make sure that it was a story that could transcend that time period. And I was just reading something that Stephanie Kemmler said today, and it hits the nail on the head. It's so relevant right now in COVID, because I'm one of the statistics of like 2 million women that had to leave the workforce to take care of their children at home, like because kids couldn't go to school, they couldn't go to daycare, things like that. And it's just a story that transcends those time periods. But one thing I was thinking of, because of this question, was that I do think it is important that readers have a little bit of background of what the post World War II in America looked like, particularly for women. So if you think about it, the workforce, if most who deployed overseas were men, right, there's a lot of these spaces for blue collar jobs that were left unfilled, and women for the most part filled those roles. We think of the character Rosie the Riveter, and so I had read a really interesting statistic that like 19 million women were working during World War II, and of which most of the workforce were married women. And so it was a dynamic that World War II America was comfortable with, having women join the fight, right? But then when the war was over, when their husbands came back home, America suddenly was not comfortable with the idea of the shift in gender roles. They weren't comfortable with the idea of women in blue collar jobs anymore. And so what women would see is that their employers, like at these artillery depots and whatnot, they would push them out of their jobs into less secure jobs, like pink collar jobs, which are, for people who don't know, those are traditionally jobs that are held by women, and to be replaced by men who came back from the war. And so, and if we think about the archetype of the mad housewife, right? It's a fun character to think about, but I think people don't like to scratch the surface and think about, well, what's really simmering underneath of there. And I had read something really interesting that kind of stuck with me. Quite a few women were saying that it wasn't that they were necessarily unhappy with returning, to domestic life. It was so much that they were unhappy with how they were treated as a result. And so that was something that I had really thought about. In this book, Lady of the House, she was a riveter, and she felt purpose. She felt power and agency, and then being pushed out of that role, only to be denied access to something like that again, it just festers in her. And I feel like that could be very relatable for a lot of people. So, yeah.
I absolutely agree with that. I think it's interesting all of the history, like in learning what it was like for women in that time period. And just it adds to the story of Lady when you read
Hmm.
through and you see her struggling to kind of just suck it up and deal with what she has been given after the
Hmm.
fact. But that feeling of being silenced, of not having your voice heard or respected or acknowledged, I think is so incredibly powerful and relatable for everybody,
Hmm.
especially women, I would say. But across the board, I think it's something that is very relatable. And I think that you carried the theme of that really well, in that whoever reads your book, I think in a way will feel like they are finally being heard.
Hmm. And something just to snowball off of, like post-war womanhood, it wasn't until very recently in American history that like a woman could open a bank account by herself or buy a house by herself. She had to have some kind of male like sign on on her behalf, or like as a co-sponsor to do that. And um, I think about how the creation of this book, it really came from my personal emotions, my personal trauma, and something like things that had happened, and how I had psychologically trapped myself, and I had prevented myself from freeing myself in a way, right? And so I imbued those emotions into a character that I thought could be relatable. And it started out with a housewife because at the time I was a housewife, and it was a role I was not accustomed to. And so one thing that I hope that people can take away from this book is no matter what the those frameworks are that are around you that make things difficult to get out of a situation that maybe you don't think you can get out of, like there's always a way. There's a way to overcome, pretty much. And so yeah, there's a lot of horrific imagery in this book, but I think people will hopefully be happy with the ending and happy for Lady and what happens. So
So, as you're creating Lady and you're creating her world and everything, did you pull any character inspirations from specific people in real life?
the only person that can be named is Grace R. Reynolds. Throwing shades at myself here. But I thought that was a really fun question because I think it could be really easy to assume that it had have something to do with people in my life. But if people who will read the introduction and will in the acknowledgement, they will know that this is really about like my own psyche in a way. And so I broke it down into this. Like basically when people are reading this book, they can see the really hard feelings of like anger, sadness, loss, resentment manifest in the form of the lady of the house. And the main antagonist, the man of the house, basically he represents like me silencing myself, gaslighting myself that like that like I shouldn't be upset about certain things, or like this, I need to move on and keep going, or just like thought terminating commentary, like, oh well, it's not that bad, like, or like things are meant to happen for a reason, where it just completely stops the thought process from keep going. And just gaslight is the word that I think, because I think that people gaslight themselves more often than not.
Oh yeah, I agree with that.
And then there's one more character in the book. There's only three characters truly. And this character just doesn't have a name, doesn't really have a title other than Dirty Bird, according to one poem. But in my mind, that character is the manifestation of what happens when lady and man like have a breakdown in communication, which, really like not being kind to yourself, and just defeating yourself in a way. So yeah, the only names to drop are mine.
I appreciate that so much. So I think it takes a lot of guts to put pieces of yourself into the characters that you're creating, especially vulnerable pieces that
Mm-hmm.
even if, let's say, someone you don't know reads your book, they don't know that this is a part of you, but you know. And then
Mm-hmm.
also there's people that do know you, that are going to read this book, and that maybe they might know you personally, and so they see you mirrored in that book. There's a lot of vulnerability in that as well. Putting yourself out there and letting yourself be at the mercy of other people's opinions and perceptions. So I think it takes a lot of skill to be honest with yourself enough to use that to create a character, and also very brave to put pieces of yourself out there that are kind of fragile and tender. And so I applaud you for that. And you know, when I read about Lady, she's so real. She's such a real character to me that I think you putting parts of yourself into her is what makes her real and makes her feel tangible, because you're real, because you're the lady of your house.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, it definitely was. I call this book like I use this a couple of times. Like, it's an act of vulnerability, right? And I think a lot of my friends who I consider to be very good poets, I think that their work is great because they're vulnerable. Because ultimately, I think a lot of people, most people, probably read poetry to connect to a central emotion of some sort. And you know, you got to write what you know. And I've lovingly told people that I hope they enjoyed this book. It is the worst of me.
I really like that, actually.
Mm-hmm.
If you read this book, it's the worst of me.
It's the worst of
But
me.
you know, I like that though. So when I started writing poetry, I kind of felt like all of the worst parts of me were just bled out and were the ink that was left on the pages. And so it was like a very poetic way of just getting it out. And even though, like, when you write about heavy topics, or you write about trauma, or you write about mental health, it's a great release. It's very therapeutic. And I think also those parts are always going to be with you. And so you're giving it space to exist in a way.
Yeah.
Giving it a chance to, like, be what it is.
Yeah, it's a way of acknowledging those horrible things that happened and letting them exist as they are. But at the same time, it's like I saw Spencer's comment. It's very empowering to do. It's empowering to free yourself in that manner, and like giving all of that over to the world, like not necessarily to help you carry the load, so to speak, but just it's a way of like also reminding yourself that you're not alone.
Yeah. Yes. And you don't, because when you put that out there, I'm often surprised by how many people can relate to it, or they'll read it and they'll be like, "Oh my God, this is how I feel," and I've never had a way to express that before, but this is how I feel. That's not just empowering for you, but it's empowering for them as well. It's just, I just love poetry so much in the way that it can connect and bring people together in a way that a lot of other art forms just can't. There's so much emotion and passion behind a piece of poetry that transcends language and anything, really.
It's like music.
It's just, yeah, it is. It is exactly like music. It's just absolutely one of my favorite forms in the entire world.
Yeah,
So,
I found it incredibly healing. I really
yes,
enjoy it for that. I don't think that there's a medium that quite matches it, like you said.
I agree. I feel like I had someone asked me what was the purpose of poetry recently, and I had to like really think about it, because I feel like it's manifold, because you can have it, because it's an art form, it's a literary, like it's something you can learn about academically speaking, and then you have your own personal vested interest for writing it, what the purpose is of it for you. And I don't know, I just feel like it's something very, very special that gives people a very unique view into you as a person.
Yeah.
So are we going to get more poetry from you? Like, what's next on the horizon? What other projects you got going on?
Oh my goodness. Well, that's a really good question. So I mentioned on my page before, I have 2 works in progress, and one of which I'm hoping to finish sometime next year. It's a novella that's based on my own family history. So people who don't know me very well, outside of writing, genealogy is a very big passion of mine. And I've been really fortunate over the I started off about 15 years ago with a family member, just, you know, as a hobby. And then really the past 5 years, just like very seriously getting into it and making contacts and, like having those connections to help unearth family truths, not just for myself, but for other people. And so that's important to me to reflect in some kind of writing. And so I had thought of this paranormal thriller idea. Right now, the English title will be called Save the Spiders. So it's a working title. We'll see how it goes. But it's loosely based off of my grandmother and her family, and when they came over to this country like many years ago. And I'll leave it at that. So that's one thing that I have in the works right now, and I've done quite a bit of outlining, but I want to do some more research before I really dive into it.
Yeah.
The second one is
I'm very
okay.
excited about that one.
I'm excited. I think it'll be fun. It'll be a good challenge. I think it'll be a really good exercise to use the tools that I've been learning. Because I also feel like I feel a little bit behind the curve in this. Like I didn't go to college for any kind of creative writing or master's of fine art or things like that. I went for political science, and so I've spent quite a bit of time this year learning the fundamentals of creative writing all over again, and like learning scene beats and whatnot. So I'm looking forward to continuing to learn that and putting that into this story. The other work in progress that I don't have an end date in sight because it requires a lot of research is I have an idea for a cyberpunk novel or novella, but I need to do a lot of research because it's not a field that I'm used to writing in, but I'm really excited about it. And it's a character I can't get out of my head, and I have to put her on paper.
That sounds super exciting. I'm
Yeah.
all about that.
But yeah, so this upcoming year, I have more of a plan to do like more workshops, like writing workshops specifically, because I really like poetry. I like being able to engage with this online community and like learning from peers on things that work, things that don't work. But I think that I really want to do workshops, or take workshops, I should say, like take workshops to learn how to write longer form better, because I think that would be just a really fun challenge to do. So
Yeah.
that's on my horizon, is taking workshops and learning how to write longer form of literature. But I have an idea for a poetry collection. I'll have to float it by you, see what you think of it. But
Yes,
there's
absolutely.
wheels
Please do
turning
that.
for
Like,
poetry
message me right away, okay?
for another poetry collection. We'll see what happens there.
So you have this, you write poetry and you also write short stories. So
Mhm.
did one come before the others? Or like, what is your favorite medium to write in? Do you prefer poetry over short stories? Or like, is there a tiered system of favoritism there?
I think I definitely favor poetry right now because I'm at a point in my life where I have to, for my own sanity, to take steps in letting myself be vulnerable as a person again. And I find that poetry helps me do that. It helps me step out and be brave. Like, and I think that you can do that with short stories as well too. So short stories came second. I love the idea of what you can do with a short story. I like the messages that you can tell with longer forms. Like I had David look over a short story I wrote a while back, and it was just so cool to think about like what the underlying philosophical message of that short story was going to be, and being able to bounce those ideas off of David, and him sharing some academic literature, of course, in response.
Of course.
um, but yeah, no, right now I definitely favor poetry for just the aspect of being able to empower myself as a person.
When you started writing, what drew you to poetry? Like, what got you into it at the very beginning?
Well, let's see. I feel like I've always been writing. I've always written poetry, probably since I was younger. But it was like one of those things you just you didn't think to share it with people. Just like for yourself.
Yeah.
Like I'd find myself thinking lines in my head, like either if I was in class, or I was at home, or even as a young adult, like at work, and I would just write down a sticky note, put it in my wallet, just little things like that. And then sometime last year, I think I was just feeling really alone. And I moved twice last year. I moved across the country twice in a pandemic. It was wild. It was wild. But as a result, was very alone. It was in a place where a community was not instant. And especially last year with how things were, how much more locked down and restricted things were, I just found myself needing to let it out. And I think this time of year also, I started around this time of year last year. This time of year can bring on a lot of emotions for people to process. And so that's kind of where it started for me. I think that I just had decided for myself that I needed to, as some people would say, spill ink.
Spill ink.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I really appreciate that. Definitely. That is a lot to go through in 1 year. So I'm glad that poetry was a good outlet for you to kind of start expressing yourself in a safe and healthy way. Because I feel like that could have been very overwhelming for a person. I mean, not that it wasn't overwhelming, but you know what I mean? Just a bit too much.
It is a lot. That is for sure. I was just thinking, I remember like earlier in my marriage, because we've moved a couple times together, but like moving is one of the most stressful things that you can do as an adult, like moving and changing jobs. So imagine not having a job and moving twice. There was a lot I needed to get out.
I think this coming year, you're going to have to like just take a break now. Just stay in one place if you can and just kind of chill.
Yeah, we are definitely settled for a hot minute, which is very nice. So, yeah.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that. So I have absolutely loved talking with you about your book this evening and pestering you with all of the delicious questions that people asked you on Instagram. Thank you to all of the people who participated. Your questions were fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. I hope that my answers satisfied everybody.
Well, if not, I'm pretty sure that they know where to find you, like on Instagram.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. Got something to say, put in my DMs.
Would you like to pick the winner for a piece of, can't speak. Would you like to pick a winner for a copy of your book?
Yes.
The Curious Corbin mug. That's perfect.
There's merch. Okay. All right. So let's see. Okay. Whose name is that? It's written by Shannon.
Shannon, congratulations.
Congratulations.
You have won a copy of Lady of the House. So copies of Lady of the House will be shipping out shortly. We're having a little bit of delays with the post office, but nothing to worry. It will all get resolved momentarily. Yes. So everyone who has bought signed copies so far, thank you so much for your support. Thank you for supporting Grace and for helping get the word out of her new book. And those will be getting out to you really soon. They also are coming with a couple special little treats that you don't know about, which is exciting.
Yeah, I'm hoping that people like them. And then, I think they're going to like them.
Yes. We will have more signed copies available in the Curious Corbin store soon. I just was not prepared for how fast they would sell out, so I had to order some more for Grace to sign. They're on their way to you to sign. So get your pen ready, because we're going to sell out of those too.
Woo. Let's do it. I'm excited.
Lady of the House.
I was going to say, I want to thank all the ARC readers out there. They've been really kind with their time, and I really appreciate their commentary. And overall, I think anybody who reads this book, I just hope that they find something to connect to in it.
I think that they will. I think that it's going to be one of those books that people keep coming back to over and over again, because it has such a relatable story, and you've created pieces that are just very entertaining and interesting and with a lot of depth. So Lady of the House will be available worldwide on December 15th. You will be able to order it on Amazon, Kindle, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, whatever major bookstore is near you, that's where it will be. And then we will also have signed copies available for purchase through the Curious Corbin website. So thank you so much to everyone who has participated, who has shared, who has done the ARCs and just been really supportive. We really appreciate that. Indie authors don't exist without indie readers. So every time that you share, like, and comment, it helps us get more exposure and get our voices out there. So we really appreciate that. Yes. Grace, thank you so much for taking time this evening to talk about your book and wave it around so that we can all see how beautiful it is.
I was gonna say like do like a little flip through of some sort.
Yes,
You can see,
that's a good
see if I
idea.
can do it like, whoa, look at the quality. It's beautiful. Wow, amazing, incredible. What's the Lady Gaga gift where it's like beautiful, amazing, incredible.
Show-stopping, original, inspired by the divine.
Yes, no, I'm really proud of this book, and I want to thank you, Raven, as well. I feel like you've been incredibly supportive, and I'm so happy to see how far Curious Corvid Publishing has come. I remember like you telling me about it, like I feel like this time last year, like when you're like, and it's just so cool to see how much has happened.
It is. It is so exciting. I'm so humbled and lucky to work with the people that I work with. All of the authors that I've had the privilege to sign with are amazing, remarkable people who are passionate and just lovely to work with. And
Yeah.
so I feel that it's just so great to be able to represent their voices. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to represent your voice too.
Couldn't think of anybody else.
Well, I appreciate everybody. Thank you so much. Remember, we might be different species, but we're all part of the same family. So, my curious Corvids, please look up Grace's book if you're interested. And we have so many more exciting things coming in the new year. We have another poetry collection coming out in January. We're going to be talking about that more pretty soon. And some other really big news that I can't tell you yet, but I promise it's going to be fantastic. So,
I'm excited to
have a
hear.
great rest of your day or night wherever you are, and we will talk to you soon.
Yay. Bye. Thank you guys for coming.
What do you do when your husband calls you early in the day to excitedly tell you that he got a raise at the company you used to work at? The one that sent you packing to open up a space for men like him, only to realize how easily you could be replaced. You bake him a goddamn pie, slap a smile on your face, and let yourself die a little inside.